evening. Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for being here with us. I would also like to welcome those joining us online as well. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. This will be our last lecture of the year. We have programs in development for 2025, and I encourage you to visit our website regularly, to subscribe to our weekly e-blasts, and to follow us on social media for updates on what we have coming up. I have some thank yous though. I would like to thank the Southern Vermont Arts Center for hosting us here throughout the year in this gallery space and in the Arkell Pavilion. As we continue to hold more programs here, I encourage you to come a bit early to see the amazing art that's on display in the galleries here. I'd like to thank GNAT-TV for being here today and a regular presence at most of our lectures, videotaping and running the live stream feature for those watching at home and afar. Thank you too to our technical assistants from Magnum PA. They help us with a seamless technical experience for which I'm tremendously grateful. And I want to thank the Northshire Bookstore for partnering with us to promote the program and to sell some books. Yes, you can purchase the book that is tied to this program and have it signed, and I would say it makes an ideal Christmas present.
I would too.
And lastly, I want to thank all of you for attending here tonight. Your participation and support doesn't go unnoticed, and it validates the work that the staff and the board do to bring quality educational and cultural programs to this community. And now, our guest is a distinguished scientist and curator emeritus at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. He formerly served as the interim undersecretary for science at the Smithsonian and director of science in the Grand Challenges Consortia. He currently serves as co-chair of the Vermont Biodiversity Alliance, a coalition of individuals, educators, businesses, conservation organizations, and state agencies, which have banded together to conserve the living organisms and habitats in our state and on our planet. His current research is focused on plant evolution, conservation, and biodiversity. His most recent book, Smithsonian Trees of North America, has just been published by Yale University Press and is available here. He lives in Dorset, Vermont, with his wife Lindsay, and I'm happy to say he's just joined the board of directors of GMALL. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Kress.
Thank you. Thank you, Gloria, and welcome everyone on this kind of snowy night. Maybe it'll get a little bit snowier the next few days. It's my great pleasure to be here, and particularly with the tree right behind me in this painting. I think very, very appropriate. I'm going to talk about trees, particularly following what I've tried to put together in this book called the Smithsonian Trees of North America, which is really not a guide. It's not a field guide. Nobody's going to carry that 6.5-pound book up to Equinox looking at trees. It's really a guide to learn how to appreciate trees more, and by appreciating trees, appreciating nature. I think we really do need to get a little bit closer to nature than we have been maybe in the last 200 years. So I wrote that book to try to help that along. So the title, and I'm sorry the screen is small here, but you can look, and then almost every photo or every image I have on here is in that book, so you can go and look at them a little bit more carefully if you want to. Even though I am still emeritus curator at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., which I visit, I have an office there and I visit the museum regularly. My wife Lindsay and I are full-time here in Dorset and live just up the road because I could not be away from trees, so I moved to Dorset to be surrounded by it. But let me begin by, maybe we can bring those lights down if possible so you could see this slide. I've spent my 40-year career as a tropical botanist. At the Smithsonian, I was able to travel around the world studying plants, and particularly animals, that visit them with their pollinators or dispersers. And so to switch gears and move kind of back into the temperate zone and look at the trees of North America was a new thing for me. And I've learned, even though I'm a botanist and should know all about trees, I learned a heck of a lot about trees by writing this book. My research has taken me to tropical lands all around the world. As I said, I was particularly interested in how plants fit into their natural habitats, and especially how they reproduce in those habitats, and particularly their pollinators, the animals that pollinate their flowers and the animals that disperse their seeds and fruits. And here's just a number of the different organisms I've studied in various places that kind of all center around a group of plants that I've worked on called, that include gingers and bananas and heliconias and such things. Very showy plants in the tropics. We don't see so many up here in Vermont. So how did I get into trees? Why trees? Well, as a botanist, I know a lot about trees. And I was just saying, the woman who wrote the foreword for the book, Meg Lauman, who gave a lecture in this series a number of months ago, she and I climbed a lot of trees in the tropics, because that's what she did for a living, and I wanted to get up there and see what animals were visiting the flowers. So I started working on trees. I wasn't isolated from trees, but most of the plants I worked on were on the ground, which is kind of where I like to be. So, but let's say it was the late 1990s, early 2000s, I was walking down Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., and I noticed every teenager was walking down, not looking at anything, not even looking at the buildings and stuff, just looking at their iPhone and I said, this can't be. We've got to change this in some way. So I said, how can I get them to look, even though they're just trees along the road in Connecticut Avenue or on the mall, how can I get them to start looking at that? And I said, let me use the iPhone to introduce them to trees. So we developed an iPhone app called LeafSnap, which unfortunately is no longer available, but it automatically identified trees by taking a photo of a leaf. So somebody could be bending over on Connecticut Avenue and see a leaf on the ground, take a photo of it and say, oh, that's a plane tree, okay. Now, oh, that's a scientific name, is platanus. And then suddenly the LeafSnap, the app takes them to a whole new world to tell them about what this tree is. And I worked on this. I knew nothing about facial recognition and image identification, so I worked with some computer scientists at University of Maryland at Columbia. And lo and behold, within like a year of making this free app available, we had over 3 million people using it around the world. And it was only for the Northeast U.S. But here in Australia, they were using it. In South Africa, they were using it. None of the trees in the Northeast grow in South Africa. But people just liked the idea of being able to use their technologies to get to nature. And I said, this is important. I then, on the other side, as part of my scientific work, I helped develop a technique called DNA barcoding. And has anybody ever heard of DNA barcoding? My wife is the only one that's... There's many ways to identify plants. You can identify them from their leaves, their bark, their flowers, or whatever. But you also can identify them from their DNA. All plants, all of us have DNA. And every species on the planet has a unique stretch of DNA. And we are able to find that unique stretch of DNA and define it for all, starting actually with trees. And we were using this, so you could use this technique to take, again, a leaf off the ground or off a tree, take a bark sample, take a fruit or a seed, grind it up, sequence its DNA, and tell what that species was. It's called DNA barcoding, because it was like a barcode that we'd use when you go to the grocery store. It turned out it worked so well that, again, we started barcoding thousands of trees around the planet. And we could go in and we could tell, for example, with one of my students, we could tell what beetles were, what plants they were eating by grinding up their guts, sequencing the DNA, and then we could say, oh, this plant, this beetle was eating this plant or this plant. So it was kind of really revolutionary, and it's still really being used all over the world in various places. They call it also environmental DNA, eDNA, and such things. Anyway, I set out to do trees because I was connected with a tree project there. So there's a couple of ways that I decided it's time for me to work on trees. In North America came about. And so that's the genesis of this book on the Smithsonian trees of North America. And I'm going to talk to you mostly about what's in this book and about a subset of the trees in North America. I hope some of you can see this. Sorry it's so small. But first of all, I want to orient you to the planet and to nature. And we'll get to trees in a little bit. But the history of our planet, the Earth itself is about 4.6 billion years old. Okay, life didn't appear on the Earth until about 1 billion years later. 3.8 billion years ago, life in small forms, particularly in marine environments, began to evolve. It took almost 3.5 billion years for life to get out of the aquatic environments and actually crawl onto land. So think of all that time, 4.6 billion years the Earth starts, almost 4 billion years later, it finally gets out of the oceans onto land. Plants evolved about 450 million years ago. First trees appeared about 300 million years ago. So I'm giving you some idea of how suddenly trees became a dominant life form on the planet. Humans, oh my gosh. Piddly 300,000 years ago, they evolved on the planet and began to dominate things. Agriculture began, and this is a very important milestone for the planet, about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So remember, think of 4.6 billion to 12 or 10,000 years ago. And fossil fuel use began about 250 years ago. So again, it gives you, now that fossil fuel came from all these plants that evolved a long time ago and then were crushed into ground and became fossil fuels, particularly coal and oil. But fossil fuel use by humans only has been this tiny little sliver of time on the planet, and I'll get into what that means today. So this is what that means. Fossil fuel use. Could be Dorset. No, not Dorset. New York City. Urbanization and massive changes in the planet have occurred, particularly as the evolution of humans, or the appearance of humans 300,000 years ago, agriculture, domestication of animals 10,000 years ago, and fossil fuel use 250 years ago. Now we have this. What is happening to nature because of these things? I list 8 things. We can go on, but the degradation and destruction of natural habitats, we all know about that. Pollution of the air, land, and sea by all kinds of things. Exploitation of species, not just trees, but medicinal plants and use of animals for food and such things. Spread of invasive species. How many of you, and I know somebody back there has been trying to get Japanese knotweed out of his garden for this entire time here. Spread of diseases. We're seeing that affect our trees all over the planet now. These are diseases that evolved somewhere else and then came to North America in this case and have now infected trees like a number of things, and I'll talk about those in a minute. New York City, urbanization is a big impact on natural habitats. Climate change. It's funny, 20 years ago, climate change probably might not even have been on this list. We knew it was happening, but it wasn't at all the problem that we see that it is today. But climate change, due to the excessive use of fossil fuels, is a major impact. And finally, one that I added, actually just a couple of years ago, was conflict and war. And we don't always associate conflict and war, whether it's in the Middle East now, in Gaza or in Ukraine, with actually a major impact on nature and on natural environments wherever they are. So all of these things together add up to a major alteration of the planet, particularly with respect to nature. Why? Simplistically, I call it or attribute it to 3 things. 1, there are too many people on the planet. 2, there are not enough resources to sustain all these people on the planet. And 3, there's a vast inequality in the use of these resources across the planet by different groups of humans. Those three things together are having a major impact on nature. So what happens, here's a tropical forest in the Amazon where I've been. I took this photo. Actually, I was in a tree when I took this photo of palms. But I've seen this happen every country, every land, every habitat that I've been to. You see forests being cut down, being exploited, the trees being shipped around the world for various things, having a great impact, not only on the trees, but on all the organisms that live in those forests where the trees are being cut down. Right now, we estimate that probably 1 million of possibly 10 million total species on the planet today are at risk of extinction in the next 50 years. So this is happening, and we're watching it happen every day. So that was the good news. Now, that was the bad news. Now we'll talk about trees. So I'm going to divide this talk into 3 sections, kind of like the book. First, the essence of trees. Secondly, the diversity of trees. And finally, have a short section kind of picking up on what I just talked about on the future of trees and what we would expect to see if we don't actually take some action right away. So the essence of trees. I want to start with just a few words about the value of trees. And actually, I was talking to somebody here when we came in, and they said, oh, this book really shows about the value of trees. And I said, that's just what I wanted it to do. There's many different values. And I'm starting out with one. It's great that I'm surrounded by artwork, because the first major value of trees and of nature itself is the aesthetic value. This is a painting by Paul Jones, an Australian contemporary painter. Magnolia grandiflora, which is pictured here, it doesn't even grow in Australia, but he loved it when he saw it. But that sort of aesthetic value of nature itself has engaged humans for centuries, if not thousands of years. Not only in art, but in poetry, in storytelling, all kinds of things. Trees have been very involved in, and the aesthetic value of trees has been very important. Botanic gardens and arboreta. I just gave a talk down at Arnold Arboretum outside of Boston, or in Boston. The Arboretum, those were always developed as an aesthetic way to reconnect people with nature, particularly in cities and places. And it's not only in the summer or the fall, but it's also in the winter. The aesthetic value of trees in the winter is just as great as it is in the summer when there's leaves and flowers and fruits and such things. So our major cities, if we didn't have trees, and unfortunately we're losing a lot of trees in our major cities, it provides this great aesthetic value. This is Tallahassee, Florida, with the live oaks, with all the Tillandsias noides, the Spanish moss hanging. Just a beautiful, and Tallahassee is known for its trees, and the South is known for the trees along the street, are very important in terms of the aesthetic value and making cities livable. And if you have leaf snap, then you can find out something about the trees and go from there. But besides this aesthetic value, and particularly in a city like Washington, in a city like Tallahassee, even in Dorset, there is also an economic value of those trees growing along the streets. They do a lot of things that we're not necessarily aware of, besides being beautiful, but they absorb excess nutrients that are flowing around our streets. They reduce heat buildup. And we know as trees are cut down in cities, the heat goes up, and things associated with rising temperatures, particularly in humans, accompany that. They control erosion. They moderate pollution. And they provide habitat for wildlife. If we didn't have trees, we wouldn't have a lot of the animals, the birds and the squirrels and such things. And they convert carbon dioxide, pull it out of the atmosphere, and reduce the impact of climate change. Trees have, the economic value of trees in cities has now been recognized for decades. In fact, most cities put a dollar value on the trees on their streets. You may be aware of this, you may not be aware of it, but trees can range anywhere from $50, probably up to $500 or $600 a tree, depending upon the part it plays in a city and depending upon how many trees there are. So we've converted this aesthetic value now into an economic value. In fact, some of you may know that Davy Trees has an app. Not quite like LeafSnap, but it's an app that you can actually determine the value of the tree in your front yard from this app. It's called My Tree. And it takes into consideration all these things, not just cutting it down and making it into wood, but all the other values that I just talked about. So it's very important, and Davy Tree saw this. So anybody that wants to go into iTree and figure out how much their sugar maple is worth can do that now. And then there's the standard economic value of trees for all the things that we use trees and wood for: construction, medicines, landscape, fuel, human food, household goods. Believe it or not, you still go into any department store, you see a lot of things made of wood. More and more they're being made of plastic, but they also are many things being made of wood. 19th century wooden ship that brought all the Europeans, particularly the British, over to North America. It took 6,000 trees to build one ship. It was not a trivial exercise at all. And that's why in the mid-1800s, 3/4 of the forests of New England were gone from cutting trees down, particularly for shipbuilding, for other things. And here it's going on today. Here's a sawmill in New Hampshire I took a photo of. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a little bit later on. The same values, economic values that trees afford us in cities are what trees are also doing in their natural environments. So there's great environmental value. They are cycling nutrients and water. They are determining the distribution and abundance of other plants and also animals. They help recovery of landscapes after major disturbance. And one of the big things is carbon storage. Right now we know trees are the best way to pull carbon dioxide that we've put into the atmosphere. It's the best way, it's the only efficient way to do that right now. Now there's all kinds of technological things that are being developed to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, but trees are by far the best. And what we've learned, and this is kind of important, particularly when we look around Vermont, we've learned that we know trees sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We can either plant plantations or we can let forests naturally regenerate. And we've now shown that natural regeneration of forests is much, 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 much better at sequestering carbon than growing in any sort of plantations. In fact, most plantations, trees get so big and then they get cut down. They're not left there for that purpose. They're there for other purposes. So when we have stands of trees up on Nichols Hill or wherever, leaving that forest to regenerate by itself is a much better way to treat or to affect climate change and everything that we're seeing of it. So there's some idea, some values of trees: environmental value, economic value, aesthetic value, and there's a lot of other values that we all find, particularly when we walk out in forest. A little bit about the evolution of trees. I mentioned that in that timeline of the Earth from 4.6 billion years to the appearance of trees about 300 million years ago. Here's a picture of a Carboniferous swamp, which is the origin of a lot of those fossil fuels that we now use 300 million years ago. Trees or plants came out of, as I said, the marine environment, became dominant on land, and began particularly to take over swampy areas, and there were a lot of swampy areas. Now everything you see here that looks like a tree is not anything like the trees we have today. These were all dominated by ferns and fern allies. Now it's a little bit more complicated than that, but all of these things that look like trees are actually equisetums and things that we find now as tiny little selaginellas and along streams here. Those were all the dominant trees in these swamp forests 300,000 years ago. About 200 million years ago, about 200 million years ago, a new type of plant evolved called gymnosperm or conifers, and we all know those, pines and such things. And then about 65 million years, and they dominated forests from 200 million years ago to about 100 million years ago. And at that point where all the dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, a new type of plant evolved called flowering plants. There were no flowers before that. They were primarily ferns and conifers. And then flowers evolved, and now almost everything we see in a forest here in New Hampshire, yes, there are conifers and there are gymnosperms, but most of the trees, like maples and sycamores and poplars and birches, are all flowering plants. So a very different life form than was available before they evolved 65 million years ago. Is that making sense to everybody so far? Okay. And if there are any questions, if you say, what was that, a gymnosperm, an angiosperm? Just raise your hand and I'll try to clarify that. What about diversity and abundance of trees? Abundance is, here's a gymnosperm forest and a boreal forest, primarily one or two species, a lot of individuals. So highly abundant, low species diversity, high abundance of any species. That's what you find in boreal forests. You go to tropical forests, you see low density, but a lot of species diversity. And that's what you get here. So to find two individual trees of the same species, you often have to walk across a forest. Now that's not true here. So low abundance of trees, but high diversity. On Earth right now, we estimate, this is part of what I've done in my career, estimate that there are about 400,000 species of plants currently on the planet. Of those 400,000, and that's an estimate because we still haven't even named all the plants, of those 400,000 species, 73,000 are trees. The rest are shrubs, vines, herbs, grasses. So the trees account for maybe a fifth of the species on the planet, 73,000. The other, maybe this was 2 or 3 years ago, using aerial photography and things and kind of with on-the-ground calibrating of trees, we estimate that there are about 3 trillion individual trees on the planet. 3 trillion. So those 73,000 species of trees are distributed across 3 trillion individual trees. I can't even really imagine what 3 trillion trees are, but that's what we see now. Now those trees are not distributed equally across the planet. So when you divide those 73,000 by 3 trillion trees into 3 trillion trees, it's not that some trees are very rare, some trees are very abundant. And that's something that I became interested in actually when I started working on this book. So, for example, in the Amazon, it's estimated now that there are 16,000 species of trees in the Amazon of South America, in the biggest swath of rainforest on the planet. So 16,000 of those 73,000 are found in the Amazon, and primarily in the Amazon. Somebody did an analysis by looking at small plots distributed across the Amazon and found that 227 of those 16,000 species accounted for half the trees in the Amazon. So that's 1.4% of the species accounted for most of the trees in the Amazon. I mean, that's quite astounding. I was interested in this. I said, wow, in the Amazon, And most of those, the other portion that are not in those 227 are all rare species, and we haven't even named a lot of them yet. Some of them we'll never even find before they go extinct. So you have to think about the abundance and what that's telling us about our knowledge of nature. I decided to try to do the same thing in North America. I was surprised this hadn't been done. But in America, we estimate there are about 1,700 species of trees, and that includes some exotics, mostly native species. I did the same sort of analysis of abundance and found out that of those 1,700, 36 species account for half of the stems that you're going to find across North America. So it's the same thing. A very few number of species actually account for most of the trees that we find. Number one species, red maple. That's And we see that around here. For this book, I was going to actually focus on the common species, and that would be these 36 species. And I said, I can't write a book on 36 species of trees. You know, that's a little. I mean, I could write a book on 1,700 species of trees, but that would be the other. I'd probably be dead by now if I was trying to do that. So I did an exercise. I kept going. Well, how many species account for 90% of the trees? How many species account for 95%? And I got up to the point that 326 species of trees, including exotics, including invasives, including native, account for 98% of the trees you'll encounter as an individual as you walk across the United States. And that's what's in this book, 326 species of what I call the common trees. So there's a lot out there. Most of the trees, most of the tree species you'll never see. I'll never see. Well, I go looking for them, so I might see a few more. But that's the bottom line on trees in abundance and species. Yeah, I'm doing okay. But what the heck is a tree? You know, that's not a trivial question. I thought, oh, well, everybody knows what a tree is. I mean, a student walking down the street with the iPhone knew what a tree was. Well, I wasn't so sure. So I asked a 6-year-old girl living in London. There are a lot of trees in London, a lot of gardens. But it's still a very urban environment. I said, Kat, could you draw me a painting of what you think a tree is? Just to get some idea of what a 6-year-old that's been on the planet for 6 years thinks a tree is. And this is what came back. Not only was it a tree with a trunk and green on the top, but there were flowers, and there were fruits, and there was bark, and there were roots. There were branches. There were worms in the ground. There were birds in the trees. There were butterflies. Here at 6 years old, she knew all about the ecology of trees. And I thought, wow, we all do know what a tree is. We don't need a definition. Well, we do. And if you go through any tree book, if you go through any field guide to trees, you will find so many definitions of trees. And I wanted to read one. This was, maybe some of you have heard of David Sibley, who wrote a really good book on the birds of North America, and also a book on the trees of North America. And in that book, he tried to give a definition of a tree. He said, you know, this is really kind of complicated. And he said, well, a tree is a perennial plant with a single woody stem at least a few inches thick at about 4 feet from the ground, branching into a well-formed crown of foliage and reaching a height of at least 12 or 15 or 20 feet. Yeah, that sounds like it. I think this is better, actually. And then he said, you know what? Here's a better definition. If you can walk under it, it's a tree. If you have to walk around it, it's a shrub. Period. So, if anybody asks you what a tree is, particularly in comparison with a shrub, you can say, just do you walk under it or do you walk around it? But anyway, there are a lot of definitions of trees, and some are very technical, and it's impossible to follow those technical definitions. Even though I'm a botanist, I should know all that. I don't. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of trees, just to give you an idea of what you might look for if you don't know what to look for when you see a tree. And we'll start first with the shape. I mean, every tree has a different shape. They're not all the same. They can be conical, like a lot of our gymnosperms are, conifers. They can be round, like our sugar maples. They can have kind of this oval. You've seen all that. They can be big and spreading. This is Kentucky coffee tree is one example of that. They can be all kinds of almost an erratic shape, helter-skelter shape, like elms and such things. So the shape of a tree is very important in terms of how it deals with nature. And it's evolved this shape for various reasons in terms of photosynthesis and other sorts of things. One of my professors, as an undergraduate, wrote, I guess it was 3 books on the shapes of trees. He called it the architecture of trees. wasn't shape, it was architecture. But they get these shapes because of the way they branch and all this sort of thing, the way they produce leaves. So there's a lot of variation in shape. So when you look at a tree, if you can stand far enough back from it, you can get some idea of its shape. Bark. Bark is protecting all that's going on inside the trunk. And we see so many different types of barks. And here are just a few, going from very smooth bark like you get in beech trees, striate bark and striped maples, black locust, some of the best bark in the world, these gnarly furrowed barks, really beautiful. The gymnosperms, here's a hemlock, have a kind of a different type of bark that's a little bit more flaky. And you get to sycamores, whether it's the West Coast sycamore or the East Coast sycamore, and they have this really flaky type of bark, and which supposedly is well adapted to urban environments. But anyway, barks are very important because they're protecting all the mechanisms, the fluids and nutrients that are going up in a tree, and all the photosynthetic products, sugars and things that are coming down from a tree, and all that has to be protected. And each of these barks does it in a different way and an efficient way. You cut into a tree, what do you see? You see all these different types of woods. And again, here's just a few examples. Wood has, I won't get into the whole function of wood, but we're building a little guest cottage next to our house right now, and we are picking out woods on a daily basis. And we've had to go through these woods and look at the grain and everything else, the color and how it, because again, every species is doing these things in different ways. And to us, there's this aesthetic value of wood that we use when we're building something. And then we get into the fun parts of trees. First of all, the leaves. The leaves are what make the world go round. If it wasn't for trees or plants and the process of photosynthesis, which simply takes water, sunlight, what is the other? Oh, air, and puts those three things together, creates sugars that flow down through the tree, provide all the nutrients for all the rest of the planet. That's all happening in these leaves. Not just trees, but in herbs and shrubs and things as well. But here you can just see a different smattering of different leaf structures. We as taxonomists, as botanists, use these to identify trees, but the tree is using these different leaf forms to do this basic thing, which is photosynthesis. Then we get to the sexy part of the trees. The cones and the flowers. The gymnosperms and conifers all have cones. Most of you probably don't know that there are separate male and female cones on every tree, on every conifer. The female cones turn into the thing that we see as, for example, a pine cone. The male cones are quite small. They produce the pollen, which is necessary to produce the seeds. But this is going on in every conifer that we see, but we often don't recognize that. But very important, obviously. And then what happened 65 million years ago was the evolution of the flower. These evolved out of cones from the ancestors of all flowering plants. And from that we get things like magnolias with these beautiful big petals. And here's the sexual part of the flower in here. Small, but still conspicuous flowers. We get things, catkins, like in birches and such things. These catkins produce the pollen, and that's what's on your car all the time during the spring season. Very important. But they've gone the opposite direction than the magnolias and have evolved very small flowers, but many, many, many of them. And then we have things like dogwoods, which these aren't flowers at all. They look like flowers, but they're not flowers. These are modified leaves that look like petals, and the flowers are these tiny things in the center. So there's been a lot of variation that has evolved in flower structure. And of course, the whole purpose of flowers is to produce fruits and seeds so the tree can reproduce. And these are just an example of different types of fruits. They could be dried fruits, they could be fleshy fruits, they can be kind of compound fruits that have little seeds in them that are covered with berry-like substances. Anyway, that's what is in this book. Every species of those 326 species, I've tried to show you all these different parts of the tree, from not so much the shape, but from bark to wood to flowers, to leaves, to fruits, to seeds. So you begin to see what these trees are made of. That was my objective. And I enjoyed looking at all these parts and photographing them. That was actually quite a pleasure. So let's go on to the ecology of trees. I hope you're not getting sick of trees yet. Nobody will look at a tree after this lecture. The ecology of trees, if you go out up to any tree, you could categorize it into three different things. It could either be a native species, and let's just think about here in Dorset. It could be a native species like your red maple, or in this case, black locust. It can be an introduced and cultivated tree, such as Norway maples that are planted very plentifully around here. These come from a different zone, a different continent usually, and are brought over because of the aesthetic value of the tree and planted in gardens and in cities and such things. And then you can get the third category is a naturalized or an invasive species. And these are introduced species that have actually decided they like it here in North America, and they've learned how to reproduce here in North America, so they kind of take over native habitats. Not all introduced or naturalized species are invasive or are causing problems, but many of them do become invasive. So any tree you go out there, you can put it into one of these three categories. I'm going to move a little through this, but if you go across North America, and I've tried to do this for each of the species in the book, trees grow in all different kinds of habitats, and that's why they have all these different, they've evolved all these different characteristics. So you go to the Pacific Northwest, you have those cloud forests or temperate rainforests, they're sometimes called. You have the redwoods and things. You go to the chaparral in Southern California, completely different habitat. It's very dry, rains only come a few times of the year, very different species of trees. You go up in the Rocky Mountains, you've got domination by conifers. You go out into the Great Basin in the drier parts of the Southwest, you've got a whole different suite of trees with different characteristics, usually growing along waterways. You come here to the East Coast, we have our famous eastern deciduous forest, which is what we all see around here, usually with three distinctive seasons, with a green season, a beautiful, colorful season when the trees are beginning to lose their leaves, and then the winter, which we've entered now, where all the leaves generally fall off. It's a very different type of habitat. Go down to the southeast, same sort of thing, different types of habitats where different types of species has evolved. There's these big stretches like the pine barrens of New Jersey, which are southern oak, hickory, pine forests, different set of species. You go down to the coastal plain in the Carolinas, in that area, these trees, these habitats have trees that are adapted to fire because big fires sweep through these areas, so their bark and their cones and everything has evolved to deal with this seasonally dry type of forest. And then we get to the floodplain forests that line all of our great rivers, particularly in the southeast, the Mississippi, the Savannah. So all these different species are different in each of these zones, and that's what has led to the evolution of these different traits. So that's kind of the essence of trees in a nutshell. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. From bark and shape all the way down to what trees are growing where and what habitats and how that has led to the types of characteristics they have. So let's just spend a few minutes looking at the diversity of trees, and this is what that book is about. There's about 800 pages in that book over there. 50 pages are on the essence of trees. The other 650 or 750 are descriptions of these 326 species. And that's the diversity of trees, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize in this book. Again, just some different types of trees, from introduced species to native species to grown species. Diversity of trees in North America, even though we don't compare with the Amazon, is really quite astounding. Of those 326 species, 41 of them are oaks. Quercus, the oak trees, are one of the most diverse groups of trees in North America. Here is just a little sampling of the leaves of different species of oak, where you can compare them and you can find out what they're like. As I said earlier, there's about 1,700 species. There's different, it's not that we don't even know the trees of the Amazon. We're still not quite sure of all the species in North America because of all these rare things. I mean, we know that there's no new species of trees coming out, but how abundant they are and where they are and such things, so there's new species being introduced all the time, which changes this number. And as I said, 326 are the common species, and of those 326, 280 species are native here and have evolved here and have lived here longer than any of us have. So a little bit about just classification, then I'll show you a few examples and we'll open it up for some questions. Charles Darwin, father of evolution, figured out how it all works. Charles Darwin has one illustration on the origin of species. It's a tree of life. He's the one of the first that came up with the idea that all life evolved from a single individual or single species through that big timeline that I showed you earlier. And he represented it by this branching diagram. And that was in 1859. We're still doing the same thing today. This is what botanists at the Smithsonian, at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, in China, in Kunming, and such places, we're still trying to place all the species on the planet into some sort of tree of life to understand how they evolved and how they're all related to each other. So this is called the plant tree of life. There are major groups, and what I've done in the book, again, is not just, most field guides are organized by how the leaves are formed on a tree, whether they're opposite on a branch or alternate on a branch, or they're compound leaves or simple leaves. I've decided to show and illustrate and list the trees in this book by their evolutionary origins. So by thumbing through this, you get some idea of how these things actually evolved from each other. There are 6 major groups. The gymnosperms down here, as I said, they appeared about 300 million years ago. And then all the rest of these are flowering plants. The magnoliids are down here at the bottom. There's something called early diverging eudicots, and if anybody ever can remember that, you have my blessing. These all have technical names I'm putting. Then there's the monocots. These include the palms and things, and we have some palms in North America. Then there's a big group called the roses, and these include the roses that we know and all the tree relatives of that group. That's the largest group of trees. And then there's what's called the asterids, because these are all related to daisies and sunflowers. And there's a bunch of those also here in North America that are tree-like. Not sunflowers, but other relatives. So let me just take you through these a little bit. This is a typical page in the book where I've got illustrations of all those parts of trees. Here's ginkgo, one of our iconic. Ginkgo is probably extinct in the wild. We've never really found a legitimate wild population in China. It's from China. But it's cultivated all over the world now, including right down the block here. You can pass a few ginkgos. Different types of cones, but it's a major component of those conifers, or those gymnosperms I was talking about. You can see it's dotted around the country. Here's a pine, Table Mountain pine, and again, you can distinguish the male cones from the female cones, from the mature cone that produces the seeds. And I've tried to illustrate all this, the leaves and how the leaves are oriented on the tree. So gymnosperms and ginkgos all form this conifer group at the base of the plant tree of life. We move up into that magnoliids that I mentioned. Here, you can see one of my favorites is Magnolia grandiflora. I've shown it several times because it's just a wonderful tree. Fragrant, it's got big beetles pollinating it. It's got everything going for it. So, but here again, you can see the leaves are much different than the conifers. Here are the flowers and the fruits and the seeds. The bark, again, some help you identify and some don't. Going to the monocots, there are 8 monocots. I study monocots. I have to go to the tropics to really study them. But in North America, there are basically palms and yuccas, the Joshua tree. Some of you may know that. And here they have very different leaves, very different flowers, and are organized very differently and have actually different. Yes.
So is a tulip poplar a magnolia?
It's not a magnolia, it's in the Magnoliaceae. So it's in,
It's a family.
yes, Liriodendron, exactly. Same big flower. My wife and I were just talking about finding one of those on campus in Boston the other day. Very rare. And that's why I put it on the cover of the book. It's one of the most beautiful trees in North America. Good question. Sycamore is the early diverging eudicots. Forget that term, but sycamore is two species of sycamore, one on the east coast, one on the west coast. Very different, these tiny flowers. You can see the leaves there. Bark. Rosids includes the maples. I think there are 12 species of common maple in North America. Here's one you might recognize, Acer saccharum. Again, look next spring. Tiny little flowers. What we look at is these things. That's what we see, and that's how we know it's a maple. But most maples have separate male and female flowers hanging in the axils of branches in the early spring, and you might not even notice this, but that's what allows a tree to reproduce and become so common in our habitats. Here's the fall leaves. Rosids also oaks. Oaks and maples are related to each other. You might not think that, but they are. Again, oaks have tiny little female flowers, these catkins of male flowers that cover the sidewalk if you have an oak in the spring. We don't even notice that. What we think about are these acorns. So there's a lot of other stuff going on. And finally, that big group related to the sunflowers, the asterids, cornus, dogwoods is one member of that. And another I put up here, there's one cactus that we call a tree, and that's a saguaro cactus out in the southwestern deserts. And it is a tree, very different leaves, very different, not so different flowers, but bark, and you can walk under it. You might not want to, but it is a tree, and we included it in the book, and here you can see its distribution. Oh, I just wanted to show one thing. I took all the photographs in this book, and there's about 3,526 photographs. I didn't take them all. I took the majority of them. I had other people when I couldn't get things. I was doing this in the middle of the pandemic. I started out by going to the Arboretum and Botanic Gardens with all my camera stuff and taking photos there. I could go out and get them. I said, oh, this is fun. I couldn't do that suddenly. And people didn't want me to come there, and I couldn't kind of. So I said, what am I going to do? I said, I know this graduate student in California. I bet she would send me some flowers in an overnight FedEx package. And I started writing my colleagues all over the country, and darn, I started getting gobs of FedEx packages. So I set up a photo lab in my house on Nichols Hill Road, and started photographing all these things. And most of the photographs in there are from things that people have sent me. Not bark, that's other people took those for me. But it was quite a challenge. Some things I couldn't find, so I went to the U.S. National Herbarium. Most of you probably don't even know what an herbarium is. An herbarium is a collection of dried specimens that we as botanists use to document the plant life of the planet. There's 5 million specimens in storage at the Smithsonian alone. There's an herbarium at Harvard, there's one at the University of California, Missouri Botanical Garden, all these things. When I couldn't get some plant parts, I said, why don't I find something in this herbarium? These are all taken from specimens that have been dried for 50 to 100 years. And I was just astounded that I could take something off of this herbarium specimen and make sense of it and use it in the book. And so a lot of things you'll see in there, and I just want to point out that these collections are important for a lot of reasons. They help me with photographs, but they are really important in terms of documenting plant life on the planet. Future of trees, I'm going to go back to what I started with. I showed you photographs in the tropics of forests being cut and lands being degraded. You don't have to go that far from where we're sitting right now. to seeing the same thing. Now, I started out by showing the economic value of trees. It's extremely important. But how we harvest these trees to make sure they can have all the value that they offer to us is a very important thing for us to consider. And even right here, you don't have to go to Burma, you don't have to go to the Amazon to see this stuff being cut down. Some of it is done in a very efficient and a proper way, some of it is not, and we just need to be aware of that. The conservation and protection of trees is the same as I mentioned in the very beginning of what's happening to nature all across the world. And here are those same 8 impact factors that are having a big impact on our natural forests and our natural lands. We have now developed ways to assess the conservation status of trees or of all plants and animals. Now, some of you may have heard of the IUCN red list of plants that lists all the endangered species. We're all doing that right now the best we can. There's a very strict criterion. Believe me, it's strict and it's not that easy and it's to come up with these, but every species is now having this criterion. We've also realized now that climate change is having the same effect. So the U.S. Forest Service has also developed a categorization of how vulnerable a species is to climate change. And so now we're categorizing all species. And in the book, I've listed both the conservation status and the vulnerability to climate change. So if you open a tree and you see something like Liriodendron, you could find out how vulnerable it is and what it is encountering right now. Very important. There are efforts at all levels to conserve nature right now, and that's something we need to think about. Kurt Lindbergh, who's here from Waitsfield, and I just were at one of the largest efforts to conserve nature called the Convention on Biological Diversity. They have a major conference every year. This one was in Cali, Colombia, just in October. It was called COP16. There were 20,000 people interested in conserving nature, all in the same room, essentially. It was quite impressive, and I think Kurt and I left knowing that a lot of people are thinking about this, and we can do something about it. Of course, there's a climate change COP also, and that was a very different story. But there's international levels, there's regional levels that we have here in New England. It was mentioned the Vermont Biodiversity Alliance. We've now started here in Vermont to try to group together our efforts to conserve nature and conserve habitats in the state. And then there are smaller ones, like Friends of the Mad River. So you can get involved in these things if you're really interested in keeping our trees alive and keeping these habitats intact in many different ways. You don't have to go to Cali, Colombia. You can just stick right here in Vermont if that's what suits you. So to end, I just would like to say a lot of people helped me with this book. Colleagues, students, professors, all kinds of wives was really important in making this happen. At all different types of institutions because it's a big book and it took a lot of effort. It only took 10 years. So I'm going to stop now. I've rambled on for much too long about trees. Take a few minutes to have questions if you have any, or comments. It could be comments as well. And then if you're interested in the book, I can also sign your book. Yes?
Could you settle this once and for all? Does sapping a maple tree hurt or damage the tree to get maple syrup?
First of all, it depends how much you do that. But I don't think it does. Trees get injured and lose things. I think you have to be careful how you do. I don't know. Some others in the audience who've done this more than I have might know that. I haven't seen maples necessarily suffer from this. That would be my opinion about it. Utilizing trees, we got to do it. I mean, they're there. We just have to do it in a careful and cautious and thoughtful way. Yeah.
Based upon your stats and concentration of species in this area, if we were to plant a tree, if we had a space in front of you, what would you suggest we should plant?
I couldn't quite hear you. Could you?
What tree would you suggest we should plant if we had the chance to do so that would help with the diversity and maybe has also within it an ecosystem that would help the animals?
Yeah, I would start with tree number 1 in the book and work up to tree number 300. You know what? That's really difficult because, as I tried to show, difficult to answer. In the habitats, trees are suited to different zones. You don't want to plant a willow in the middle of a dry area. Willows like it wet, and they like to grow along streams and things. So if you want to plant something in your front yard that's a kind of a typical front yard, plant a maple. I'm sure you've got plenty of maple. But maples are good because they grow big. They sequester a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're pleasant to look at. They've got those great little fruits that come down. So there are some suggestions in there, but there's not one tree I would say. Well, no, Magnolia grandiflora. Yes.
I was wondering, I've read or heard that there's a theory that trees communicate with each other through their roots or in other ways. And I was wondering if you had heard that theory and whether you had any feedback.
I knew somebody would ask that question. You know what? Yes, trees can communicate. They can interact with things, with other species, particularly underground, with mycorrhizal fungi and such things. They do get along with birds and squirrels and stuff that they depend upon for pollination. There's all this interaction. They do not communicate and do things the same way we do. And that's what kind of gets on my nerves when people try to anthropomorphize about trees, as if they're talking to each other the way that I'm talking to you. No, they don't. They can communicate, and we're learning more and more about that. That DNA barcoding stuff I was talking about, we never could identify a root underground. Well, unless you dug it all the way back to the tree, what was that root doing and who does it belong to? With DNA barcoding, now we can identify what species those roots are and how they're interacting, if they are interacting. So as more technologies become possible, we might be able to see some of this. But trees do not talk to me, and do they not talk to each other. They do communicate, though. Yeah. Sorry, it's a kind of little bug of mine. Yeah?
DNA barcode, it appeared in that photo that it was a big barcode. A, is that true? Is it an actual barcode I can scan? And B, does it contain all of the DNA identifying
Yeah.
attributes?
The actual physical barcode I showed was simply an allusion to the term DNA barcoding. But what you get is this little string of base pairs, A, G, C's, and T's, which is what DNA is made up of. And there's a few genes in different groups of plants. Plants have one gene that is very good at DNA barcoding. And there's like a 500 base pair segment, if this is not getting too complicated, in there, which is so diverse, it's variable between species. So I can identify, if I take that root out, suck that gene out, and sequence it, I can tell that different from a different species of root. We don't have to sequence the whole genome by any means. Some people do for other reasons. But the good point about DNA barcoding is it was a very short segment and easy to extract and identify. In fact, I remember talking to the Board of Regents at the Smithsonian, if you can imagine that. And I had just received a handheld, not iPhone app, but a handheld sequencer that I could hold in my hand the size of a cell phone. You can put a piece of tissue in, and it would sequence it and give you the DNA barcode. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to go work on something else. So
So to clarify, it's not a barcode. You're just
No.
using that term to say I've got something that's common.
that's right.
Identify the sequence.
That's right. And you have to find this little gene inside all the genes and then sequence it and do that. Was there another? Yeah.
So here in the Northeast, we're using ash to emerald ash borer.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you know of other insects that are devastating species around the rest of the United States.
Well, there's that. There's the woolly adelgid beetle that's going for hemlocks. I mean, you go out, you see on our beaches around here that are all being infected, not necessarily by insects. Usually the pathogens are carried by insects. But we're going to see just more and more of this until, well, the chestnut blight, the same sort of thing. I think, and in the book, again, I didn't memorize all this, but it talks about pathogens. It also talks about which species of tree host specific butterfly larvae so that they could reproduce. So there's all these plant-animal interactions going on out there. Some not so good, like the woolly adelgid or the emerald ash borer, but others that actually are good. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as more and more trees are moved or diseases are moved around the planet.
So do you know of some particular insects in other parts of the country that are devastating certain species?
Yes, but I can't list all of them right now. Yeah, there are definitely. There are. Question in the back, and then maybe.
Do cultivars confuse the picture of what?
Last question. I don't think we need to go any further. Yeah, they do. They do. But I mean, we all like those different cultivars of apples. Come on. In terms of confusing what picture, what part of the picture?
Sometimes I see a leaf and I'm like, oh, it's going to be this tree, but it doesn't quite look right.
Oh, yeah. No, definitely true. And some of those, the common cultivars are listed in the book, so you can distinguish some of those, but it's not, I haven't gone into every cultivar. But they certainly can confuse because they don't look like a normal sycamore or something. You know, they look like a different one. Or they're a hybrid between two species, and you say, wait a minute, this is halfway between this and halfway between that. So there are problems. That's partly why we developed DNA barcode. DNA barcoding, because we could avoid that problem by looking directly at the gene sequences. Leaf snap, there were some problems with that, with the hybrids and the cultivars. I didn't mean that had to be the last question. I was just joking. If there are any more. Yes?
I'm not sure if this is a fair question, but in a general sense, what is the health of the forest here in Vermont or in the Northeast? How's the forest doing?
I think the forests are doing well because they've been allowed to recover since the mid-1800s. And we want them to recover even more and not go the opposite direction. It may be inevitable, as we just were talking about, with diseases and insect pests that are being, but in general, I think our forests are pretty darn healthy. And I think you get more closer to urban areas, you have more problems because there's more people, there's more pollution, there's more all these things that are not great for nature. But in general, maybe because Vermont is pretty far from a lot of those urban areas, we're doing a lot better. But you see, I mean, out in California and in the Northwest, the fires and stuff that have been ravaging these forests that have been there for centuries, we need to pay attention. We need to pay attention, to say the least. I think there was one more question in the back. Yeah. Magnolia doesn't do so well here. But I had to sacrifice something to come to Vermont. So, first question was? Any arboretum. I mean, I think a place like the Arnold Arboretum, because it's in the middle of a city, it is just a refuge for people to get back to nature. And Morton Arboretum out in Illinois is a great arboretum. I mean, I started my career as a director of research at a botanic garden, so I've been associated with botanic gardens and arboretum my entire life, and I think there's none that aren't worth visiting. So I would say, and it also depends where they are. And if you're in the middle of a city, it has a lot different impact than if it's out in the country somewhere. But most of them are associated with urban areas in some way. Favorite tree? Gosh, I'm kind of partial to the conifers right now, to the spruce and the hemlocks, the things I see around here. Tamarix, the larix, is just one of my favorites. And when all the leaves turn bright yellow-orange in the fall, it's something that I find really attractive. But I'm still learning a lot about trees, and I'm still learning to appreciate all of them. So, Gloria, maybe we should stop there. One hand over here? Yes.
You did mention the devastating fires of California, and not just California. What is your position on the use of fire for managing our forests? As for so long, we had a no burn policy, and there's so much fuel in the forest now that we have these tremendous wildfires. You know, in some places, prescribed burns are a way to manage and develop healthy forests, but that's not always popular.
No, it's a tricky question because it's not only is it good to burn or not to burn, it's how you burn, when you burn. A lot of that, keeping the understory relatively low so you don't have these massive fires is an important thing. As I was saying, those pine barren forests in the southeast, they are meant to burn. They're maybe not meant to burn on our schedule, but they are meant to burn and they're adapted to burn. So I'm not sure if I could say good or bad on that. A lot of the fires that we saw, were man-made started, or people-made started, and are very unfortunate. But I think you have to look at the particular area where you're in the particular type of forest and how it should be managed. But I don't think anybody could say, there's only one way to manage forest through burning, whatever type of forest it is. It just doesn't work that way. So, sorry, not a good answer, but it's... I wouldn't burn a forest myself. No. Well, thank you for listening about trees.